afternoon. This is a bit of a strange phenomenon to speak, but not hear you. But I'm Kerry Wilbur, and today I will be speaking to you about my second study, which for the purposes of She Presents this afternoon has a working title of How Does Workplace-Based Assessment Work Abroad? I'll begin with a bit of background about myself and study one and how I've reached this current point. I look forward to your perspectives on these study findings and avenues to pursue from here. So I am a Canadian trained pharmacist with my professional degrees from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada, and the University of British Columbia. I went directly into clinical practice in internal medicine at the major tertiary care center in the province. And for a number of years, as part of my roles there, I was a practice educator. And when I say that, I mean specifically in the context of what I'm going to talk about today. I served as a clinical supervisor to pharmacist trainees. After a period of time, I had the opportunity to move to Doha, Qatar, to be part of the founding faculty of the first domestic pharmacy training program in that country. So I moved away from providing direct patient care myself to assuming roles in educating those who would. So in Canada and even internationally, I've always had what I would say is access to role models in pharmacy practice and pharmacy research. But now I found a big gap with respect to mentors in health professions, education, and research. And the portfolios I held has significant responsibility and influence over the curriculum at this college. I'm really fortunate that one of my colleagues in Qatar had already enrolled in the PhD program at Maastricht and was having the experience that I was looking for. And now I find myself as part of this community and fortunate to be under the supervision of Drs. Eric Dreesen, Felicio, and Pim Tunisum. So it's about 5:30 a.m. on a very rainy Vancouver morning. So I'm coming to you not from Doha anymore, as I decided to relocate to Canada to take a new position back at the University of British Columbia. And approximately 45 days ago, I repatriated to Canada. So in the Qatar University and UBC positions, I have functions across various aspects of the pharmacy curriculum, but my heart still lies in workplace-based education. Now, the nomenclature varies somewhat across health disciplines, but in pharmacy, clinical supervisors are often referred to as preceptors, and you might hear me using that term. I believe Derek earlier used clinician maybe, and students participate in or mentors, I believe actually Derek said, and students participate in what Derek was calling clinical clerkships. They may also be called internships or rotations. I'll do my best to be consistent with the terms here this morning, but if I do alternate between them, I do mean the same thing, and that is the workplace-based component of a curriculum. What many may not realize about Qatar is the investment it's making in its healthcare infrastructure, which includes the education of health professions. And there are no less than 10 disciplines with programs in Doha, and all of them are affiliated somehow with a quote-unquote Western partner. Dominique Waterval is someone who has written extensively about these partnerships and models whereby a branch or satellite of the home campus is established in a foreign or host setting, and the curriculum is delivered by local host faculty with or without contributions from home faculty. Like almost anything, there are pros and cons to these academic relationships, and the difficulties include conflict inherent in the local delivery of a curriculum developed in a different setting. So a home country with different healthcare or educational infrastructures, as well as societal norms and values. Janneke Frambach has specifically studied cross-cultural application of problem-based learning across contexts. Lee and Wilby have also taken a closer look at the adoption of OSCE in non-Western settings in their studies. And there are others, but no one in particular has purposely explored the workplace-based element of health professional curriculums in exported or transplanted programs. If you combine this with what we know or don't know about clinical supervisory judgments and how they are influenced by unconscious biases like leniency and halo effects, how there's mixed understanding and prioritization of competency domains, et cetera, I think there are interesting questions around assessment in the workplace-based training within a transplanted or exported curricula. So the first study was inspired by the work of Ginsberg and of Bogo and Reger, who sought to elicit the complex constructs underlying clinical supervisory perspectives about student competence in medicine and in social work, respectively. Like them, we interviewed a group of pharmacy preceptors and asked them to give personal accounts of students in their supervisory experience who met, exceeded, or fell below their expectations. In our case, we interviewed two distinct cohorts, supervisors from Canada and supervisors from the Middle East. The Middle East supervisors were pharmacists who were participating in the workplace-based training of students enrolled in a Canadian or an American accredited program being delivered in their region. Now, I realize this next slide violates all principles of good slides, lots of information in tiny font, but I show it to you to help with understanding of the methods of our study too. So from these interviews, 7 major themes with some sub-themes represented how clinical supervisors described pharmacy student performance, and these were consistent between Middle East and Canadian supervisors, with negligible variation in their relative prioritization. Like the North American supervisors in social work and medicine, these pharmacists also identified things like motivation, positive response to feedback, positive attitude, as some of the traits influencing their ratings, which, as in medicine and social work, do not expressly appear in any competency framework or workplace-based assessment tool. So in our next study, we continued exploration of rater impressions in workplace-based performance in the Middle East and in Canada to determine the level of agreement for student characterization, what cues can drive these impressions, and if they may be culturally oriented. Now, various models for exploring cultures exist, and they tend to have overlapping concepts or domains. In HOFSTEDE's cultural dimensions theories, effects of society's culture on its members' values are outlined by 6 domains, which include power distance, for instance, the level of acceptance of inequalities in authority, which in Middle Eastern countries tends to be high compared to somewhere like Canada. Individualism is a domain whose corollary is collectivism. So this is emphasis on independence and achievement of personal goals, which is also, that aspect is low in Middle East societies compared to places of Western origin, for example. And uncertainty avoidance, which is affinity for rigid infrastructure and rules, which also tends to be relatively high in Middle Eastern societies compared to somewhere like Canada. Now, Qatar is not uniquely represented in HOFSTEDE's data set, but is expected to parallel the positions of the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as Kuwait, which is not depicted here, but does graph the same. Others using this framework have shown the relative differences in countries' positions within these cultural domains can partly explain behaviors of students exposed to the teaching and assessments of transplanted or exported programs. So in our second study, we again sampled a group of clinical supervisors in Canada and in Qatar, and we asked them to offer a rating of exceeds, meets, or below expectations for student performance described in a vignette. This format is similar to that of the clinical vignette, which is a short and purposely written description of a person or situation conceived to simulate a real-world scenario and used in teaching or assessment purposes. In our case, the person is not a patient, but a pharmacist trainee. Now might also be a good place to give parameters by what we mean here by workplace-based assessment in the title of the talk. Unlike medicine, pharmacy does not have multiple workplace-based assessments. So what I mean by that is while performance is meant to be directly observed, it typically has no separate distinct form to record or evaluate the task. So what I mean here is there's, for example, there's no mini CEX or mini SEX for pharmacy per se. But like medicine, there are, of course, a variety of competency items to be rated on an internship training evaluation report. But like on a rotation, we are asking the supervisor's overall impression of whether this trainee meets their expectations to be assigned a pass on their clerkship. These student vignettes were reverse engineered, if you will, from the data from study 1, according to the 7 main themes identified. And this work is akin to the standardized narratives devised by Reger and Ginsberg in their study of assessment of resident performance. Let me show you a vignette to illustrate. This particular description of a student M is mapped to the following 9 themes and sub-themes you'll see over on the side of the slide. The nature of the described performance or behavior also has valence. So some aspects would have been considered positive and are underlined in green, and others unfavorable. And that's indicated by being underlined in red. So a collection of 16 student vignettes were deployed through a web-based platform and presented in random sequence to each participating supervisor, who was asked to assign an overall rating according to their expectations of the trainee. So the supervisor would read a vignette such as student M, and according to their overall impression of what they read about the student's behavior and performance, would give a characterization of meets below or exceeds their expectation. In a modified Delphi method, these ratings were aggregated and shared with participants who could then alter their initial choices. But this process was done distinctly for cohorts separately. So there was a Delphi round for the Qatar pharmacists, which was separate from the Delphi round for the Canadians. Intra-group consensus was considered achieved if the level of agreement within those participants was 80% or greater. From these findings, we then conducted follow-up interviews to gain further perspectives and clarify the rationale for their characterizations of the trainees described in these vignettes. And we conducted content analysis on this textual data. So on this slide, you see 2 pinwheels. Each slice in the wheel represents a student vignette. And you'll remember there were 16. So in the Canadian cohort on your left, clinical supervisors agreed that 3 vignettes describe students who met their expectation. So they're colored in green. Green means good. 2 vignettes describe students who exceeded their expectation, and those are yellow. I guess gold is golden. They also agreed that 7 vignettes describe students who were below their expectations. The colorless slices depict the student vignette numbers whereby no consensus was reached. The pinwheel on your right represents the Qatar cohort, which shows clinical supervisors agreed on only 2 students who met their expectations, 6 students who were below, and no students who exceeded their expectations. No consensus was reached for 8 students. For the follow-up interview component, we purposely chose student vignettes for participants to revisit. These included descriptions without intra-group consensus, so Qatar and Canada, Q and C, so vignettes 5, 6, 10, and 15. We also chose vignettes which had relative disparities between the groups, Qatar versus Canada, or Q versus C. And we also chose 3 vignettes where both cohorts rated the student the same, since we do not necessarily know if the reason supervisors in Qatar or Canada did so might actually be different or important. What we found that clinical supervisors in Canada and Qatar expect pharmacists to demonstrate the same fundamental professional skills and ability. Knowledge was valued, but must be coupled with application under specific and often changing patient conditions. These supervisors also expect trainees to readily establish their roles in the care environment, contributing to patient care decision-making by the team. Other exhibited student traits influence supervisor impressions, including reliability, training disposition, their commitment to patient care and the learning experience, their affability, and response to feedback. We did not find aspects of Qatar supervisory judgments which we may have anticipated given the diametric positions in uncertainty avoidance, individualism, or power distance compared to Canada. So these supervisors in Qatar encouraged independence, discounted some elements of team harmony, and expected trainees to respectfully challenge physician authority. So these findings are largely consistent with study 1 in that any difference in supervisor expectations of pharmacy trainees was not overtly detectable. In the realm of cross-border partnerships and transplanted curriculum, experiences have shown how consistency between the host and the home can be elusive given the change of context. That is, teaching faculty, practice faculty, healthcare systems, these are all significant variables. So what is happening here? Well, first, our assumption that HOFSTEDE is a useful model for this work might be wrong. But we do know that others have used it for study of quote-unquote campus-based differences in teaching and learning. And it's also been used to explore differences in the practice norms of relocated international medical graduates. What we may be seeing here is that a professional culture is superseding any possible distinctions of geographic culture. So have supervisors in Qatar and Canada formed a community of practice across borders? Thirdly, we're not sure what the influence is of organizational cultures on supervisory impressions. So have these Qatar supervisors created micro environments of expected pharmacy practice? Or is there something about these Qatar inpatient settings where students from the 9 other training programs in the country converge in some way to alter the culture of the institutional's healthcare training and disciplinary roles? I would also say that we detected what I call a supervisory culture. It was clear that there were heterogeneous perspectives about coaching or mentorship of students who fell below expectations. And we identified the proverbial hawks and doves across both Qatar and Canada. So it would seem from our initial studies in this Middle East population, where pharmacy education has been transplanted from Western settings, may not be subject to the tensions of local adaptation as it pertains to expected workplace-based performance. In this particular geographic context, it would seem reassuring that students are being trained to the same standards and rigor offered in the home curricula, but this might not be the case elsewhere. Our team has also discussed that this might not be the best way to elicit cultural differences among clinical supervisors, which could be a direction to head in study 3. I'm not sure. I see I'm a bit over time, but I'm interested in your comments and questions. Hopefully I'll be able to hear them.